The movie project was the major oral communications exercise in the first half of the semester. The origin of my revolutions class was, of course, to come up with a big idea, which is the main point of ACOL 100 along with communication. And I had taught a course on revolution before, and it ties together a lot of different disciplines, history, which is of interest to me, social science, different dimensions of social science, different disciplines within social science. It allowed students to read about exciting events and exciting historical figures, but also to think about connections and relationships and patterns, and to introduce themselves for the first time to political science theory as a way of understanding some of those events and some of those patterns. My movie project definitely didn't require them to produce a movie. It required them only to come up with the movie plot, and that required them then basing their plot, or at least the structure of it, on the pattern of a revolution and on the motivations of the characters of a revolution. All revolutions are said by some scholars to have a certain unfolding and a certain set of motivations. And so it was important that even though they were making up the plots and making up the characters and making up the settings, and there was no limitation in that regard, they could be in outer space, they could be an alternative universe, they could be in historical fiction, they could be among animals, they could be among animated characters. That didn't matter, but they had to set the movie in a way that it followed the pattern of a revolution, that the motivation of the characters had to reflect that of people engaged in this kind of social movement. For each group developing a movie, they had to come up with a plot, they had to come up with characters, they had to come up with setting. And I allowed them as a group to decide for themselves who would take what part in the oral presentation, but I reminded them that all of them were responsible for the ultimate product. I wanted there to be a division of labor, but not so much of a division of labor that they simply went their separate ways when they were preparing this. They enjoyed doing the movie project in particular because it gave them this kind of unlimited opportunity to be creative, but it also encouraged them to think about the material they had read, and I think the creativity really got them to think more about what they had read, and it was kind of a little bit of synergy, and that generated some real enthusiasm. The students definitely got a greater sense for what it's like to be in the midst of a revolution, or to think about revolution by coming up with their own topics, by trying to put themselves in the place of people directly involved. The idea was initially that they would be most reluctant or most hesitant in public speaking if they were afraid of being wrong, if they were afraid of being inaccurate, of me calling them out for historical inaccuracy or details being wrong. So by the time they got to the more substantive oral presentation, at least they had had an opportunity to go through it one time with something that was sort of cost-free. It didn't totally remove their inhibitions about being wrong. The final presentations, which were on actual historical revolutionary events, still generated that little bit of nervousness about whether they're saying the right thing. But I think it helped a lot of them get over those inhibitions more easily. They were having fun doing their presentations. They were going through the interaction with the rest of the class. And later they got to see themselves in action, and they got to critique themselves. They had to critique themselves. And they could be pretty ruthless on their own style. They could oftentimes be a little harsher on themselves than I was. Sometimes they missed certain things in their own self-critique, and I encouraged them to take a second look. But it was a very useful way for me to give them an opportunity to see themselves in action. I'm in the planning stages for teaching it again in the spring, teaching the Revolutions course again in the spring of this coming year. And there are certain modifications. I think I will expand the movie project, actually, because it was one of the most successful elements of the semester. There are certainly some things on the substantive side that I'm going to change because the readings and so forth got a little dry after the midpoint of the semester. But I think the use of Panopto and the teamwork on the plot of a movie would be the main elements that I will definitely retain from previous semester. I know that my Call 100's primary focus when it came to communications was strictly oral communication, what you might regard as conventional, straightforward stand up and speak, although there was the fun of the movie plot. But I would be curious to hear how other people are approaching it and learning a little bit more about newfangled ways of thinking about oral communication or communication more broadly.